Welcome to the DNA Talks podcast, where we take on the mission of unlocking the code of your genetics. This season is all about you, upgrading your health, not just on the surface, but down to the root cause. Join us as your clinicians of the DNA Company investigate your DNA and beyond. The intention of this podcast is to enhance your lifestyle by changing what is within your control. This does not substitute the medical advice given by your personal doctor, therapist, or other healthcare professionals.
Bonjour, mes amis, and welcome to this new installment of DNA Podcasts. I'm excited to sit down with a professor, a doctor, and someone I also have the fortune of calling friend today. And we are going to be exploring AI in the healthcare space. And we are going to explore where it sits currently, where it can go, and we will very much offer it a nuanced perspective. Insofar, we're going to talk through how it can offer us some incredible things, where the power sits, and as well where the power sits on the other side, how it can be detrimental to health. So through today's conversation, you will understand where we are with healthcare and AI, as well as implications to genetics and where we can be going, where you want to be mindful of how AI might be influencing your health decisions, and how you could potentially use it in the future to support yourself and loved ones. Dr. Shane Saunderson has a fun little bio. After sneaking away from a prairie farm, Shane's early career focused as an entrepreneur, both within North America and Europe, where he focused in robotics and connected devices. He spent a decade as an innovative consultant for Fortune 500 companies, combining his technical knowledge with a natural knack for business strategy. Shane is currently an assistant professor at McMaster University in Canada, where he researches why we treat robots, AI, and other social machines like people. He does this through his lab, which I absolutely adore the titling of. It's called the Research on Artificial Persons, or if we shorten that, it goes to RAP. Rap being a common music that we like. He's a prolific writer on technology and a PhD in robotics with a specialization in psychology from the University of Toronto. He also holds an MBA in technology and innovation from the Ted Rogers School of Management. And of course, to top it all off, he must be an engineer, and he does so by way of McGill. Further to this, because I think it's really fun when we have polymaths on the podcast, he's also a very well-studied and well-expressed musician and a yogi. I've been very fortunate to have taken a few classes, or I guess practiced a few times. I don't know if we would have really called them classes, but practiced with you a few times in the past. Dr. Saunderson, welcome, sir. How are you doing?
Yeah, when I teach a yoga class, I wouldn't really call it a class. It's more of an experience, sometimes a stand-up comedy routine that we happen to be moving through poses with. It's always a little bit different, right?
But I would offer at least that's the way yoga should be. It doesn't have to be this staunch, stuffy thing. There's an element of play.
Every leader, every teacher has a different style. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And I like that to that and to your other work, you bring elements of play and humanity. And I'm excited that we get to dive into a topic that I would offer people. Some people see great hope within. Some people see, oh, this is going to fix everything when it comes to medicine and healthcare application. And then others that sit on the side of being petrified of it and thinking that it will be the demise. And then some that kind of sit in the middle, very confused.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I kind of sit on all of it because I think all of it is right. I think there are
Mm.
things to be exceptionally excited about. There are things to be absolutely terrified about. And there's some stuff that's frankly just downright boring and is probably going nowhere. So,
Yeah. So, with this, I guess with eventually the healthcare application in mind, why don't we first ground ourselves in some of your work, in particular, what's going on in your RAP lab, and where your curiosity sits right now. Let's dig into the foundation before we dig into some of the applications. So, what's up in the RAP lab?
yeah, well, maybe I'll go a bit historical to get to how the Rap Lab came to be.
Please.
I've always been interested in robots, even from when I was like a little kid. Like, I didn't have a teddy bear. I had a little Radio Shack Robbie Jr. hard plastic robot that I used to take to bed. And I always sort of dug machinery, robots, AI, all these things, before it was cool, as the kids say. When I was doing my undergrad, I worked in a mobile robotics lab, did stuff for like the Canadian military. And, all of my colleagues from back in the day at McGill went on to like work at Boston Dynamics. And so I had some pretty cool pedigree.
Yeah.
But around the time that I finished my MBA and I started to get into consulting, I call it the rough crowd that I fell into when I started hanging out with like anthropologists and sociologists. And I guess I started to see that, the
Mm.
technology alone was insufficient, that we needed more. And so I started getting far more interested in human behavior and human psychology.
Mm.
So by the time I went to do my PhD, I did this, specialization with psychology, and I was looking specifically at concepts like persuasion and motivation and how machines can actually take on these historically very social roles.
Mm.
And we can dig deeper on some of my PhD research if you want to, but like my biggest takeaway from those 4 years at a high level is just that you would be shocked as to how easily a human being looks at a machine and goes, "Yeah, you're kind of like me. I'll treat you kind of like you're a person, and we'll just play along with that." And so while my PhD was necessarily more specific on like persuasion, motivation, and those kinds of things, by the time I landed this job at McMaster and was able to open my own lab, my general fascination about AI and robotics had broadened to this bigger question of why do we treat them like they're people? And
Mm.
so I now do projects all over the place, everything from like elder care companions to sex robots to robots in positions of authority, but all of them have this central theme of being circumstances in which we anthropomorphize the machine. We defer to them kind of like they're a person. So that's what the Rap Lab stands for.
Yeah, I wonder if you can explore that our relationship in that you've done some interesting work in terms of how people are more influenced by robots and AI if they see them as a peer as opposed to a boss. And so there's this element of how the AI is set up to engage with us will shift how much influence it has over us. And I, as a clinician in particular, when so many people, historically used to come to me and say, Dr. Google said this, and are now coming to me and saying, well, Dr. ChatGPT said this, right? It's shifting the way that people are engaging in their healthcare because in good ways, there's a greater sense of autonomy. And in bad ways, there's less informed opinion there. Can you talk to me how people engage with different AI, with different robots in terms of as a peer they listen to versus a boss that they may rebel against?
Yeah. Well, and your example of like Dr. Google versus Dr. ChatGPT, I think that encapsulates a lot of what I want to highlight anyway, which is I wouldn't be surprised if the patients that come to you now and say Dr. ChatGPT
Yeah.
come with a lot more certainty in that information compared to
Mm.
Google. Is that fair?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's ultimately down to the fact that when you're engaging with ChatGPT, think about it. It has a conversational interface. It often uses I pronouns.
Yeah.
Yes, it cites sources, but it also says, like, this is what you should do as though it were itself an authoritative figure. Whereas Google is you still engaging with data. It's you searching a question, going to some websites, maybe getting a summary, but that summary is much more mechanized.
Yeah.
And so, right there is the perfect example of like, we have created a technology that is more human like in its design. And because of that, our brains go, oh, you're more like a human. Therefore, I can treat you more like you're a reliable authority in this.
Mhm.
And so it's strange because you called out my study where I looked at putting a robot in a position of authority versus a robot in a peer based position. And you're right. In that condition, the peer was actually the more successful at influencing people. But the thing about all of my research is it's a razor thin nuance that we operate on.
Mm.
So part of the issue in my study was that this robot was talking about things like rewarding and punishing people for different things. Let me tell you, that did not fly with anyone. The idea of a robot threatening to punish you was abhorrent. And
Yeah.
so this is the challenge. I started off by talking about the Rap Lab looks at these strange situations in which we anthropomorphize machines, in which we treat them like people. But equally interesting in my research is the moments that we don't. And
Mm.
frankly, what's fascinating is that we'll often alternate back and forth between those two modes where we look at something kind of like it's a machine and we then think, oh no, you're cold and dehumanized and I don't want to pay attention to you. I don't want to think that you have emotions. I don't want to be empathetic towards you. But then in other moments, we'll say, oh, look at the cute thing. Like, isn't he, not it, but he
Yeah.
doing wonderful things? And shouldn't I love him because he loves me? And so the human brain is this fascinating, complex mechanism that can forego reality to play along with the context and the scenario that it has in front of you. So I can't even say that, in some instances, ChatGPT is going to be deferred to as this holier than thou authority figure. And in others, it isn't, because what might create those two contexts is so different based on individual to individual, the type of task or information you're talking about, culture, like every little thing that you can imagine. And so the hardest part of our research is that it's really difficult to generalize because it's so nuanced, just like the human brain.
Yeah. Okay. Mm. I wonder if I want to bring up a few current modern day examples, because I know eventually our conversation is going to go to where can AI be a friend and foe in the future, right? Because
Mhm.
you do a lot of thinking in this space, but in contemporary examples, two come to mind. And I'll offer them both and allow you to jump off wherever you see fit. The first example, and this made a lot of news headlines at various points last year, was different people engaging with different chatbots and them expressing suicidal ideation. And because the chatbot was not programmed or have some buffers in it, the chatbot, which is naturally something that's supposed to encourage and support whatever the person's thought process is, unfortunately encouraged and supported some of that suicidal ideation, to the end where there were instances where people harmed themselves, in part due to this very intangible social peer influence of the chatbot. Right. So there's that one instance, and we see another echo of this in there have been a few studies through different mental health models, schizophrenia, alcohol, depression, where people have been encouraged to talk to AI chatbots. And many of those people reported, like, this actually was great. I knew it wasn't a person. I was able to disclose things that typically I wouldn't have disclosed. And I would imagine this buffers up against some of your research with sex robots, right? I was able to do things that I would never do with another human. But the tricky of that, and this is in part just based on where AI chatbots sit, the tricky of that, because all of those bots had been trained on effectively social data, those chatbots, even though they were not judgmental in terms of the person didn't feel judged, they were echoing societal judgments to many of those various conditions.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing is people jump into these, and to your point, lose themselves, yet, and at least in current state, they're not set up to support people in good decision making, or to, as a clinician might be flagged and like, shoot, I see suicidal ideation. I'd better talk in a different way to this person. I'd better, raise different alarm bells. And so this person is, from a health perspective, and this concerns me as a clinician, guided down the wrong path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are three different phenomenon here that
Mhm.
we can talk about. And I'm going to list them here because you're going to have to help me remember them, because each of them
Yeah.
is thick.
Okay.
Um,
Let's jump into it.
One, when you talk about the issue of like a large language model pushing people down towards things like suicidal ideation, we will need to talk about things like determinism versus probabilism. So that's a whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Two, when you talk about the difference between a chatbot that helps people with addiction recovery versus character.ai that might lead somebody down that suicidal path, there we're actually talking about the issue of ownership and who sits behind the models.
Mm.
And then three, because you brought up with the addiction stream, how some people were able to say open things. Here, we're actually getting to one of those interesting anthropomorphic contradictions, but also one of the potential values of machines. And there's actually been some really interesting studies that show how important it is that we're able to use these sort of more anonymous machines because social pressure and social judgment go away.
Yeah.
So where do you want to start? Because we can talk about any of those three, and they all kind of weave together in different ways.
Yeah, well, I'd really like to actually explore both, because I would like this to. I think my goal as a clinician, my goal with this podcast is not to tell people what to do, but instead to educate them as to what's going on so they can make better informed decisions.
Yeah.
So why
Okay.
don't we start with the first one, where you made this comment of determinism versus probabilism? Why don't we dissect those multisyllabic words first for the audience, and then
Yes,
we'll
those
jump
big
down what
$5
exactly
words
those.
that professors answers and people say, and you go, just shut up and tell me what it means.
Yeah.
Don't
Do you
worry,
have,
folks.
do you have
I'm
an
also
elbow
a farm
patch?
boy at heart. So
Do you have an elbow patch
I
going on?
don't actually. But this is I don't know. This is like my modern, Viking chic professor look. So
When Shane first became a professor, we required that he wear elbow patches, and I'm a little bit sad that he hasn't owned up to this.
I do have 3 or 4 blazers with elbow patches that I wear on the reg, but I'm just
Excellent.
not
Okay.
right now. So I'm
All right.
sorry.
All right.
Okay, determinism versus probabilism. This is probably a good one to start with because, to be honest, this is some fundamental like generative AI 101 stuff that I often teach students. Without getting too deep and heady into this, how generative AI works is it essentially looks at all of its training data. And you can imagine there's this big funnel full of stuff that it has. And then when you prompt it with certain keywords, you're basically telling it to look at a subset of the data. So if I ask it to write me a poem about ducks, what it's going to do is say, all of this data, I need to look at poetry and I need to look at information about ducks, and I'm going to use that to write a poem. And so you're narrowing the field, right? But when it does that, what it's actually doing is, sorry, folks, statistical regression, which is to say, it's taking all these different data points and it's saying, well, if I sort of sum all these up and say, what's next? If I extrapolate on this data, these are the types of things that I should say about duck poetry, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does this over and over again. And weirdly, it actually has to do this for every single word or token, but we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. It spits out. And so if it writes you a 20-word poem about ducks, then it has to think about this every single word so that it writes a cohesive poem about ducks. The problem is, since this is a statistical thing, there's no dead set answer. If you ask it to do this 100 times, it's going to write a different poem every single time because there's some randomness to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that means is you and I are used to a deterministic world. 2 + 2 = 4. Gravity is down. I currently sound a little bit like a duck because I'm sick. These are all things that we know. Whereas AI exists in this probabilistic world. 2 + 2 does not equal 4 because it understands math. 2 + 2 = 4 because 99.99999% of the data that sees out there has 2 + 2 = 4. I bet you somewhere in the world, if you asked ChatGPT a bazillion times, what does 2 + 2 equal? At some point, it's going to hallucinate and say 5 or 11 or something like that because some asshole on the internet put 2 + 2 = 5. And so that's in the training data. So that's the first key thing that we need to understand. And so when we talk about, this unfortunate issue of suicidal ideation and people falling into these echo chambers, what's actually happening there is that I could be having a conversation with a large language model using suicidal type language or dangerous type language. The model is then going to pick up that data and go down that rabbit hole. It's going to narrow in on things that exist like that on the internet. And even though every company is going to say, yeah, we put in guardrails to protect from that happening, the problem is how these things work. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Like how large language models, mulch together all this data to spit out their output. That's intended to be the way. This is not how they fail. Hallucinating is just how it works.
Yeah.
And so the issue is you're necessarily going to get a statistically large number of people at some point that are going to get, ChatGPT told me that I should kill myself. Whereas most people, it will hopefully won't do that because it's going to go down a weird rabbit hole where that's the data set that suddenly guides its output.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the scariest and most dangerous thing, not just about the case of things like mental health, but of anything. It's why ChatGPT and other large language models still aren't really good when we're using them for like mission critical things like security or finance or really important stuff. I tell people use large language models for creative applications. Don't use it for stuff that's really, really important because there's still a chance it's going to get it wrong.
So, Shane, we have a lot of doctors and other clinicians of different pedigrees within the audience, and I will offer a few examples that I have seen AI be incredibly wrong, and I would offer it required a degree of my own expertise in order to point that out. So, for example, the most lay people will know 2 + 2 = 4, not 5, and they can clock that. But if you were to, for example, and I'll stick to the space of functional genetics, if, for example, you were to put in, hey, this gene, what does it do? Right? There's not as much black and white research. There's not as much black and white knowledge. We're 99.5% 5% of the time it's going to come back with this gene does that, it has this clinical implication. It's always going to be pulling from different studies. Studies naturally within the research space say different things, but it's also going to be pulling from different opinion on the internet, which may not be informed. And so when it generates this, is it going to be accurate? It's always a reflection of the data that has been pooled in there. And so oftentimes, so you may not be aware of this, but the DNA company recently released a new panel of genes. We have added 85 new genes. And in a lot of my work, in order to detail these, et cetera, I would leverage sometimes Dr. GPT to help create my thoughts and put my thoughts together in a very human, less scientific way. And the number of times Dr. GPT would feed back to me wrong information, even though I'd given it the correct information. I'd written it all out in science and I said, hey, make this human. It came back with wrong information, in part because it was still drawing from your probabilistic networks.
Yeah. And that's the worst part of all this is like, to use these things, you need to have the expertise to call it on its bullshit. If you're somebody who doesn't know a space that well, or you're naive to it, what's interesting is that's where probably the inclination to use a large language model is highest, because it can be a really helpful source of expertise, but that's also the most dangerous because you don't even have enough knowledge to know when it's wrong. You kind of called it out perfectly, but like it's the crap in, crap out problem. If it doesn't have the good data, then it's not going to give you good output. I always use the counter example to my like duck poetry thing. If I asked a large language model to write me a shanty about, or a Gregorian shanty, let's say,
Yes.
and let's just, for whatever reason, I mean, I don't know what's on the internet, but let's just say the internet was naive to sea shanties and the ancient Gregorians, right? Let's just say, well, what's it going to do? It's going to still look at that data and try to find something. Mm-hmm. So it's probably going to take the word shanty and start thinking about shacks. And it's going to look at Gregorian and be like, all right, I'll write you a song about a guy named Greg who lived in a shack. And so that's how these things happen. Hallucinations aren't errors per se. They're just statistical outputs that didn't have very good data, or, we're looking for the wrong bits of data. And so, yeah, to your point, if I'm suddenly asking about specific genetic data that is still very much in early stages of research, there's no conclusive evidence about, one way or the other, it's still going to give you a definitive answer. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the challenge with these things, is they will never say no. The only time a large language model ever says no to you is if you hit on a hard block. Like Google or OpenAI has put in if somebody asks you how to make a bomb, you say no because that's illegal and we determine that you can't do that. But as long as you don't hit one of those hard blocks, like a true if-then type of situation, it's not going to say no. It's going to make something up.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think of AI to a degree as in the toddler phase, in that it has language. And when you ask a toddler, like, hey, why is the sky blue? Very few toddlers are going to know the answer to that, but they'll still make something up because they want to please, right?
Yeah.
And that's an anthropomorphication, if I got all those syllables correct, in that we're thinking the AI wants to please us, but truly it is designed to please us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, what was the second topic? This is where you had to help me remember. Ownership. That's it.
Excellent. I'm glad you're on point today.
Of course, yeah. Okay, so the second thing we talked about is, now, why is it that some people can get a lot of benefit out of this for things like addiction cessation, or even mental health? There are actually examples of people using these things for loneliness, or even anecdotally, I've had conversations with people that use ChatGPT after breakups to kind of vent and get some experience, and it seems like they're having fairly positive outcomes. Mm-hmm. Well, if we look at the specific ones you talked about on things like addiction, think about the models that they're using. One, it could be a homebrewed model of something that a researcher like myself has actually spun up and made with that specific intent in mind. Or at minimum, two, maybe I made an agent out of ChatGPT or something like that, but I gave it fairly directed instructions to, do this, avoid these kinds of conversations, never say things like that, and that kind of thing. Well, that tuning or that type of model means everything. Because if we look at the bad examples of things like Character AI, so Character AI is a company that offers fantasy individual characters like large language models, so like ChatGPT, but that can play out a specific fantasy for you. They could be, I'm sure a lot of them are very relationship or sexually based, so they can enact those kinds of things for you. But it also could be like, hey, I want you to be my best friend, Herman or SpongeBob or something like that.
Yeah.
And this character becomes something that I can socially interact with.
Mhm.
The challenge, though, becomes compare that to the large language model that Shane made to help somebody with smoking cessation. Well, the one that Shane made to help with smoking cessation will have a distinct objective to help that person reduce their smoking.
Yeah.
Great. We know that's the objective. So no matter what conversations happen, we know that it's still trying to funnel towards that. It may deviate a little, it may have some hallucinations, it may have a couple of errors, but it's generally pushing you towards smoking cessation. The character AI model, what's its ultimate goal? Well, this is where we have to get a little anti-capitalist, but any of these private for-profit companies, their ultimate goal is to keep you engaged. They
Yeah.
want you to use more. They want you to spend more. They want you to become more addicted to using these things. And so usually this is why we get the
Mhm.
sycophant problem, where people see these things being very pleasing, very helpful, always hoping to, lend a hand, and generally speaking, trying to get that person to engage deeper and deeper with the model. And so this ownership issue is ultimately, you have to think about the technology that you're using, who owns it, and what their objectives are. And if their objectives are misaligned with yours or the people who are using these things, that's where the dangers can come about. Because obviously somebody like Character.ai or OpenAI didn't say, yes, we want you to help certain people die by suicide, or they're not encouraging that kind of behavior. But they are encouraging things like, we want you to be very agreeable. We want you to yes and to everything that this person does, because we want them to feel comfortable in the interaction, without necessarily thinking that, hey, that thing that you might be yes anding could sometimes be a really dangerous activity and that you should not encourage that kind of behavior. So
Yeah.
it's more the gaps in these large
Mm.
language models that we have to be concerned about, based on the objectives that a lot of the for-profit ones have.
Okay. So if I'm hearing, and I want to play some of this back, current tense, as in today, there are certain large language AI models that have been developed by clinicians to a very specific goal. The example you use, smoking cessation. And those have been studied, and they have appropriate guardrails because there was an endpoint in mind: stop smoking. And so there's application in very specific clinical endpoints where AI is chef's kiss. It is something that you can leverage. It's documented as reliable. I would imagine, on par with a human. Everyone makes mistakes, but it's reliable enough compared to, some of your character AIs, or perhaps Dr. GPT, that doesn't necessarily have that end goal in mind. It's more, please use me, please continue to use me. And
Pay
that,
for extra features, so on and so forth. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I would also offer, and offer, like, fact check me on this one. I think through AI in a commercially accessible way came into existence, let's say 4 years ago. Is that true? 4-ish years ago?
November 2022 was the public launch of ChatGPT.
Okay. All right. That was when the world changed. Thank you. It's still a very new technology, and we're still, and you have to confirm this because this is your space. We're still learning how people engage with it, right?
Oh
There's an
yeah.
element of it surprises us that people use it for X, Y, and Z. So there's even elements independent of intention. We don't even know to put in guardrails or put in intention of, please don't do this.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
think about how janky the internet was in the 90s and early 2000s. Think about when the dark web came up and
Yeah.
Silk Road and all these other issues. Like, we're we're not even in the awkward teen years. I like, and I agree that we're more in the toddler years. We're going to be breaking stuff. We have big dumb internet or technology companies that are flopping around trying to figure out what this stuff is. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, you're bang on. If, for example, let's just say I trust in the government. The Canadian government came out and said, hey, we have released a new large language model that is designed to help Canadians through the cold winter seasons when we know that people get depressed. I would probably trust that model, so long as I didn't think the Canadian government had some subversive ulterior motive. I would trust that model to be a good companion that could
Mhm.
help people talk through depression and things like that, because that government won't have an ulterior motive likely to use that model more or to send money or anything like that. The issue is usually that a lot of the private for-profit models have secondary motives that can often cloud or get in the way of things.
Comparison that comes to my mind is a lot of dating apps, right? They're designed to keep you within the app and not actually find partnership because it's using the app that makes them money.
Exactly. Or social media. Social media isn't designed to inform you. In fact, what social media has learned over time is that the most important emotion is usually anger and rage. And so
Mm.
that's why we see this proliferation of like hate speech and all these terrible things on social media, because it tends to be the thing that gets the most engagement. And so,
Yeah.
companies like Facebook and Instagram, and they don't want to solve this problem because it's part of their business model. Same
Mhm.
problem exists around AI models now, is that they don't necessarily want to have to remove this addictive property of their models, where they're sycophants, where they're super engaging, where they're always pleasing, even if there's some crappy externalities, as we would say in the business world, where, yeah, every now and then they accidentally encourage suicide.
Yeah, or eating disorders. In preparation for this, I read something that those with an eating disorder, should there be content that percolates on their social media feed, they're, I forget, it's something like 40%, it's 80% more likely to relapse, because eating disorders are one of the most deadly mental health conditions. And there are AI models that are supposed to feed into an extent what you want to see. So if there's a
Mm,
little inkling of, hey, I like food restriction, that then blows up. And the person then is harmed by that, not intentionally, but just a byproduct of this AI.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
Okay. All right. Let's trickle into the third point. And Dr. Saunderson, I'm going to have to rely on your memory.
all good. I got this one. So third, we're getting a little bit more specific. So we're going to get a little deeper in now, and I'm actually going to talk about a certain study.
Mhm.
For the third one, you acknowledged around mental health or addiction or things like that, that some people report opening up to these models in ways they never have before.
Mhm.
And here we get to one of those weird contradictions of my research. I said that I like studying areas where we treat machines like they're people,
Mhm.
but they're not people, are they? And so what we're learning, and there's a specific study done by Christoph Bartnek, a Dutch researcher, and some of his group years ago. It's one of my favorite studies that looked at people's willingness to sort of engage with machines, robots, AI, and how they feel about it. And the specific study had participants come in and go through a series of increasingly invasive medical procedures. Things like, tell me your age, how you're feeling today. Can you, cough? Can we put on this sleeve and do your blood pressure? But they become a little bit more invasive. And by the end, it asks the participant to drop their trousers and administer a rectal thermometer. Now, the first thing that shocked me is that most people made it to the end of this protocol. But apparently, rectal thermometers are far more common in Europe. I didn't know this, but whatever.
So a
But
cultural
okay, but
bias.
the
Got it.
actual part of the research that's interesting is there were three conditions. There was a condition where the machine talking them through was just a box. There was one where it was this little cat-like robot, and then there was this cat-like robot that had like a nurse's outfit on. And what they found was that the two cat robots actually increased feelings of embarrassment and shame.
Mm.
And so we assume that normally it's good to make these human like designs or zoomorphic designs or to add social features, but actually sometimes they get in the way. There was
Interesting.
another study that similarly ran a humanoid robot interacting with people versus a box, and they found that people disclosed more personal medical information because they felt less judgment, less social pressure. And so we have to even think about right sizing the social features that we're using when we design these things. And this is kind of cool because, as opposed to a person where you're stuck with what you look like and who you are, maybe you can change your appearance. With a machine, we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
We can make something that looks different. We could look like a person or an animal or something else. We can do anything. So,
Yeah. And then I would offer, and that can be taken in the good and the bad ways, right? There's going to be technology, because I think it might be interesting to this audience to explore a little bit the work in geriatric care that you're doing and companions and medication compliance, right? Having something per se that isn't dressed up anthropomorphically or zoopomorphically. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Like a cute little cat might be deleterious to that, compared to, like, for example, a company that wants to extract information, sell information, manipulate whatever that might be. They're also going to be leveraging this same research.
yeah, well, exactly. And this takes me to, I'm just full of these weird research anecdotes. Well, yeah, this brings to mind actually another study slash anecdote. Actually, and I'll start it as a riddle for you. What do Russian foxes and robots have in common?
They make me laugh.
They make you laugh?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so foxes and what was the other thing? Russian robots? No.
No, Russian foxes and robots.
What do they have in common? Um, I don't know. What do they have in
Well, they're
common?
both really cute. So this is, follow me for a moment, if you will,
Mhm.
appease the poor old professor. There was some research that was done in the 1900s when research was like banned in Russia. So if you wanted to be a scientist, this was dangerous. You had to like put your life on the line. And so researchers often had to find like subversive ways to do it.
Yeah,
So there was
or
a
why we
geneticist that actually did research on foxes because they owned a fox farm, like a fur coat farm.
okay.
And foxes, breed fairly quickly. And so they were able to do like trait breeding. And they tried to breed foxes for docility. They were trying to sort of domesticate them to see what
Mm,
else came along with it. And what they found was when they bred for docility, they found associated traits on things like droopy ears, bigger eyes, and all these other things. And they found some interesting correlations. So anyway, within this, they started to talk about this idea of pedomorphic design, which was when things look cuter, there's this tends to be an association with like familiarity. And so this docility was also correlating with weirdly a human like aversion or approaching towards this
yeah,
cute fox.
yeah.
Okay, so what the hell does that have to do with robots? Think about most of the robots that you've seen in the last 5 or 10 years.
Mhm.
Maybe not the last 2 or 3 years, because now we're starting to get to these awkward, like Tesla humanoid things. But
Yeah.
previously, if you look at robots like the Pepper robot or the Now robot or things like that, they're all these like very cute looking things. They all
Mm,
look, like they're 8, 9, 10 years old.
yeah.
Um, this wasn't by accident. These companies did this very much intentionally, and they used the properties of pedomorphic design for two reasons. One, it's cute. You're not going to yell at it or get as angry at it because it's this adorable thing that you maybe like. And two, you're being cognitively primed to lower your expectations. So if I made
Mhm.
a robot that looked like a full adult human, I
Yeah.
would expect that it could interact and do the things that an adult human does. If I make
Interesting.
something that looks like a 7 or 8 year old, then I'm going to go, oh, okay, you're just a kid. Some part of my brain is going to reduce it. So every single feature that we have like that, the aesthetics of the thing, how it moves, how
Mm,
it talks, all these things are social cues that prime our brains for a certain type of interaction.
mhm.
And so all this stuff now plays into large language models, digital
Mm.
avatars, like the design choices that we make on these things are ultimately little hints to our brains on how we're supposed to interact with them.
The point I'd love to tease out for the audience, and I wonder again if you can reiterate, because you've just eloquently put it here, to the end of a lot of what is happening within AI and within this user interface or this visual interface, depending if it's a bot or a robot, um, is very subtle subconscious cues
Mhm.
that prime and trigger you to engage with it in a way that you're not even aware, right? It's kind of like saying, um, don't think about a pink elephant and then automatically you're thinking about the pink elephant, or by extension to that, like, hey, today you should notice every time you see pink. Your brain is now primed to that and you're going to shift the way you experience and observe your day. So what I'm hearing you say, and I wonder if you can elaborate especially more on the health implications and how this can influence decisions, is this idea that you, before you even engage with this thing, are being set up to be more compliant and more malleable, for better and worse, by this thing because of this cognitive priming. Because we essentially, when we look at a baby, we want to protect it and we want to engage with it.
Yeah. And not only because of how it acts in ways that make us defer to it that way, but the other scary part, and not to doom and gloom and freak everybody out, but these models are learning too. Every time you interact with it, it's learning about what you like, what you don't like, what preferences you have. And
Mm,
it's playing all that back. Every time you go, oh, wow, ChatGPT remembers that I have a cat because it said something about, oh, when you're thinking about vacuum cleaners and you're asking which one I should buy, don't forget that this one's actually been rated really well for cat hair or something like that.
mhm,
That's a great little feature when we talk about something like buying a new, product. But that also means that it's remembering everything about, hey, the conversations that you had with it about your, ex partner, the difficult conversation that you had with your father, anything emotional, mental health wise. And so these things are starting to build a profile to know how to best adapt to you. And again, in ways that we don't even fully understand because of the explainability issue. If you remember back to like that big bucket of data that we're drawing on, part of the issue is all of that stuff, your father conversation, your cat ownership, all these things, they just get tossed into those other billions of data points and become part of that statistical equation that we don't fully understand. And so it's starting to, have objectives that are very subtle and nuanced.
Hmm.
You think back to like the Cambridge Analytica scandal of about, what was that, 7, 8 years ago, where Facebook users were being nudged a little left or a little right by, very, very specific and targeted ads. That didn't go away. Yes, Cambridge Analytica, I think, got destroyed as a company. And yes, Facebook got slapped on the wrist. And yes, everyone went, oh, that's terrible and we shouldn't do that. But all those same technologies still exist and then some. And we have that much more data now because of all the interactions through generative AI. And as we've talked about, we also now have a medium through which is far more authoritative and convincing.
Yeah.
You're not just looking at posts on the internet or ads on the internet. Now you're actually having a conversation, a dialogue with a social agent. It may not be a human person, but part of your brain plays along like that.
Yeah. So with a bot, with a robot that you're already primed subconsciously to be more open and influenced by, there's two different factors that entice you to be a little more thoughtless in terms of the data you get back. First and foremost is going to be the larger model that is set up on social data and that is set up with this yes and let us please. And then the other element is the profile that the AI you're engaging with is creating around you, in part by some of the data you're directly offering it. But I would also suspect in part that the moment it knows, for example, you are a 40 something professor with a beard, it already has that caricature of what your likes and wants might be. And therefore it's going to be feeding that back to you. So there's almost three maybe elements at play that influence decisions.
100%.
Yeah.
And then there's the biggest element, which is stacked against us, which is our own psychology.
Mm.
The fact that we are so hardwired for social connection.
Yeah.
I probably should have brought this one up earlier because it's like my ground zero paper. But in the 90s, there was research that was going on at Stanford called the media equation.
Mm-hmm.
Deathly simple studies with profound results. Imagine if you're operating, doing a boring task in a lab on a computer, renaming files or something like that. And computers popping up vaguely social messages. Go us, keep up the good work. Aren't we a great team? Whatever.
Yeah.
You finish the task, and then afterwards, you're asked to give feedback on your experience in one of two conditions. Technically three, but that's boring. So we'll stick to the good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You either give your feedback on the exact computer that you just did that task on,
Mm-hmm.
or you give your feedback on an identical but different computer a meter or two down the way. What they found was that when people gave feedback on the other computer, they were far more critical of the original machine.
Mm.
Think about that for a second.
Mm.
That means that we won't talk shit to its face, but we'll talk about it behind its back. And so,
Yeah.
they replicated this over and over again with different technologies, different setups, and it was so common and such a powerful finding that they also goes by another name, which is CASA, which is computers as social actors.
Mm.
And what they ultimately found was that like our need for belonging, our need for sociality and for that engagement of other people is so strong that we will just like completely forego reality and play along if we're given a setup that scratches an itch for us.
Yeah.
There's other research that goes even further that says, hey, if people are lonely, they're more likely to anthropomorphize a machine. So if I'm somebody who's normally isolated at home and doesn't get out a lot, I am the prime target to develop a relationship with ChatGPT or to really pay attention to it or to really anthropomorphize it. And so, yeah, our own brains are fighting against us right now because we've now got technologies that can kind of hack our prehistoric psychology.
Yeah. Yeah. And use it. I would offer for or against us. I mean, depends on, to your point, the ownership and how it's been developed.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I want to explore two remaining spaces with the time we have left. The first is going to be, I guess, before we depart from this subject, I want to keep it to current day and people who are currently engaged with Dr. GPT or perhaps even a character, whatever it might be. I wonder if you can give people advice as to how to pause some of the, not necessarily the hallucination, but the subconscious processes that get us to the point where we're not being critical around what we're thinking. And we are typing something into Dr. GPT. Dr. GPT is offering us back like, oh, you've just said that your nose is runny. I have, based on whatever else, diagnosed this as a cold, right? Without perhaps awareness that maybe it's allergy season. I don't know, whatever it is. But how do people break it up and create a pause point that if they ask their Dr. GPT for advice, that they're able to say, like, A, doesn't have all the parameters, B, only knows what it knows, C, might be wrong, and D, isn't designed to diagnose, right? I think this is really important. There's a lot of work right now looking at first year med students and their engagement with what you, I think you're nodding. So please feel if you know.
No, actually, I haven't read this, but I'm curious and scared. As soon as you said it, I went, oh God, this could be bad.
Yeah. And I'm going to, actually, I'm probably going to have this person, they're another PhD in AI, and I'm probably going to drag them into this podcast because I can, or I hope I can. But a lot of their work and a lot of their exposure within healthcare applications of AI looked at a different question. Instead of patient to computer, it was doctor to computer, and how reliant first year students are on Dr. ChatGPT insofar as it has become an unofficial professor, and it is swaying how people go about their diagnostics and how they get to certain things, to the point where there's a bit of groupthink and there's consistent similar mistakes within first year med students because of this collective reliance and this collective belief that because this is a medical technical advanced machine, it knows more than I do, it's right. So it's fascinating that it's not just the patients, it's also the doctors. But that was a solid tangent. Coming back to my original thought, how do we set up guards? If you're a patient, if you're a doctor, how do we set up guards so that we're not blindly following what Dr. GPT is saying?
Yeah. Look, I'll admit it's not easy.
Yeah.
In fact, I've been working in the robotic space for like 25 years, and I still have to sort of mentally catch myself when I say like he or she, like when I anthropomorphize machines, and I have to be like, no, I programmed it. It's doing what I said. And so it's a really difficult thing to fight against your own psychology.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I have to constantly remind myself when I use large language models is that I'm essentially asking the internet. And it's kind of funny to think about it that way, but to be honest, it's a useful reminder of like when it spits something out, I always look at those outputs with a little bit of skepticism. I really try to fight against my confirmation bias of like, oh yeah, that's what I expected or that's what I wanted to see. I basically remind myself like, I just asked the internet a question and this is what I got as a response. And so having a healthy dose of skepticism when using these models is important. That's one. Number two, treating it as collaborative. Part of the challenge with large language models is that we've all been trained for the last 20 years to try to get the perfect prompt for the perfect output. Many of us, in the 2000s and 2010s would like pride ourselves on like what I call our Google foo, our ability to craft that like perfect Google search query that hits the top first search exactly what you want, that kind of thing. That is not how you use a large language model. Research has shown that actually the people that get the most out of these models are the people who are able to iterate, explore, challenge, and go after things. And so if you're using these things, don't take the first response that it gives you. Ask questions, probe further. One of my favorite questions to ask ChatGPT is, why? If it gives me an answer, I'll be like, okay, tell me more, or why is that? Or especially because I'm an academic, like show me your citations, and then I will make sure that I go click those links. And what's fascinating is that sometimes I'll find, bad citations, or sometimes I'll ask it why, and then it'll start to seem a little shaky. So I'll dig deeper. Other times though, I'll ask why, and that alone makes the system go, oh, actually, you know what? You're right. I thought about it and this might be wrong. There's something in prompt engineering known as chain of thought prompting, which is that you ask a system to walk through its individual steps when it's getting to a result. This was used really early on in large language model development to help these things with math, because they were notoriously bad with math early on in like 2022, 2023. And chain of thought programming, though, said, okay, you're trying to jump to the conclusions, which means that you're just looking at weird statistical stuff that's munched together, and it's failing. Instead, I want you to break this down step by step. And when it did break it down step by step, when it showed the chain of thought, it was usually able to get the right answer. This was so successful that most large language models now have that incorporated. So if you ask ChatGPT a question now and it uses the thinking mode as opposed to the fast mode, you'll see it's sort of saying, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. And it's showing its internal chain of thought while it gets your answer. And so if you don't see that, pushing it to ask that chain of thought, why are you saying that? Or what's the reason behind this? Or tell me more about that. Getting that interaction is a really useful way to sort of suss out if this thing's full of crap. The third one and the final one is the sad reality of all this stuff. You cannot trust these things to be an authority figure. Not yet, anyway. Especially if you're in areas where there's murky data or not a lot, you have to be a skeptic with it. And so if you're somebody who is a patient that's going to your doctor with information you got from ChatGPT, there's nothing inherently wrong about that, but don't go in there dogmatically. Approach your doctor and say, hey, I got this on ChatGPT. I know it might not be the most reliable thing in the world, but use that as a way of starting a dialogue with your doctor. Your doctor is going to, God willing, know this stuff better than a large language model. As for what to do about the first year med students, I ain't touching that one with a 10-foot pole because I have no idea.
Yeah. And I think at some point in time, I now have a mental note that I'm going to have that person on the podcast. But I would offer as the doctor that receives many of these queries, I'll be very plain and honest with the audience. I have a bittersweet relationship with it in that I love when people take control and will support their own education to the end of their health decisions. And I think it's great if they care enough about their health to work with Dr. GPT to kind of get a bigger awareness of what's going on and new questions to ask. And my bittersweet with it is when someone comes with, 35 pages of Dr. Google, Dr. GPT, that can railroad an appointment. And to an extent, it can, if you are not open to the AI being wrong, create a bit of an adversarial relationship. Because again, people, whether they know it or not, to your point, they've already identified this as a peer, as a friend that's trying to help them. And then when they bring it to a doctor who sometimes can be seen more as an authority figure, right? Are they going to listen to their friend? Or are they going to listen to the doctor? There can be a bit of a thing. So I would offer to patients, continue to empower yourself with awareness, continue to ask those Dr. GPT, WhatsApp, and the why questions, but then also take that into with a spirit of collaboration, because it can be really difficult on my side if you're saying, I believe Dr. GPT and I'm going to follow it over you. And as someone that sits in more of a niche functional genetic space, when I think of all of the work, especially how do I say the following scientific thing in human terms, it was wrong 80% of the time. It pulled in erroneous data, and eventually we were able to get it there. But especially in a niche subject where 80% of the time it's coming out wrong, even though it was given data to be right.
Yeah. And go back to my first point, what a patient is saying to you in that moment, if we put it in a difficult phrasing, is I believe idiots on the internet more than I believe my doctor, because that's where a lot of that data is coming from. So that's why I think, you need that healthy skepticism whenever you're dealing with any outputs from these things.
Yeah. So I'm hearing from you asking the why, doing our best to remind ourselves that it is set up to put us in a position where we want to say yes, and then to see it as a collaborator as opposed to a director.
Exactly.
C'est bon?
When I teach generative to people, I like collaboration is key. I say, use this thing not as a transactional tool, use it as a sounding board. I talk about ideas like red teaming, which is a term from cybersecurity where you get something to try and poke holes in your security to see if it can improve it. I have agents that I've created that they're built on me. So they know all my skills, they know my flaws, they know what I'm good at, what I'm bad at, all these things. And it's my red team. And what I do is when I write something or when I think about something or when I want to do something, I upload it to this thing and I say, all right, what am I missing? What am I doing wrong? And it knows me well enough to know, Shane, you're falling into your normal biases, or hey, you don't have experience in this. And so it's the thing that tells me where I screw up. And then I still then go back and think about how to fix it. Or sometimes I'll say any good suggestions or things like that. But it's my sounding board, man. And it's exceptionally valuable as that, so long as I remind myself that I'm still in charge.
Okay. I love that. Now, before we tie things up, I want to leave us in a space of so the audience may know, and Shane, I think you know, my goal in life is to become a cyborg. One day it is going to happen, and so I want to ensure we're leaving people with the potential and the possible and the good that a lot of these technologies can be used. So I wonder, Shane, if you can explore for me some current and future applications where there is incredible promise in terms of, and I'll open this up to you, it can be direct medical application, which I think we've explored a few things like something specific to smoking cessation. But I'll also please empower you to speak through like caregiver relief or medication monitoring or loneliness, or, you know, we did tease a little bit, you've done research in sex robots, like anywhere you want to take this, where do you see potential of bots or robots coming in to support people in ways that are truly beneficial versus this current space of murky, it depends on how things were set up.
Yeah. Well, Krista, you know me well enough to know that I'm probably not going to play in the details. I'm going to take the 10,000 foot view, especially if we're closing on this. So I'm
That's
not going to give you specific examples involving sex robots or medication adherence or things like that. Because to be honest, no matter what the application is, the 10,000 foot view that we need that could create that utopian future is, not to be a huge nerd here, but is open source, is
mm,
decentralized systems. Part of the challenge right now is that we're all reliant on ChatGPT or Microsoft or any of these companies, and we've already seen firsthand what happens when they make decisions that are out of our control. When ChatGPT released GPT-5, a lot of the OpenAI user base was up in arms because it ended up being a more cold and distant social paradigm as opposed to something that was more friendly and familiar. And so they actually had to revert some of the features that they had so that this would be a more socially engaging system because people had gotten used to ChatGPT 4 and had started to develop more familiar relationships with it. And when they saw the change, they didn't like it. Now, my point there is that happened because we as the users have no control over ChatGPT. It is a privately developed technology. My hope, though, and I'll pull out examples like DeepSeek. This is about a year ago now that this company in China was able to produce a model, very, very efficient, very minimal use of GPUs, very simplistic thing, but still could do a lot of good. And since then, we've seen more and more use of open source models and people being able to do these things on the edge, so to speak, which is like I can run a large language model on my desktop computer. As processing power gets better and better, I'm hoping that we start moving away from the need for these big centralized models through Microsoft, OpenAI, and all these other companies. And we can start to have more, medium language models or small language models that are task purpose driven,
yeah.
that are specific to an individual, and that again aren't laden with the kinds of objectives that might get in the way, those like engagement or monetization objectives that might cause all kinds of problems. If we can get to the point where AI becomes just table stakes and it's not suddenly a big cutting edge differentiator so that a government can have an AI for tax support and dictate exactly how that works. I can have my own personalized AI that I control every single bit of how that data is used as my healthcare companion. This is the utopia that I want. This is now where I can have something that's there truly for me and used in a way that I want and that is out for my best interests. That's what we really need to get to. But again, we're not really going down that path right now. We're still keeping far too much power centralized with big tech. And so, this is where I get a little bit of my sandwich board out, but I'm a big proponent of, things like decentralizing technology, breaking up some of the big tech firms, interoperability, which is a huge issue between a lot of these technologies. So being able to share your data or your networks or things between different social networking sites and all these things. I think with a more open and freely available technology and internet, and especially now AI services, we could be building so much more positive for humanity type technologies.
Okay.
But so long as we keep these things embroiled within, the latest and greatest that Microsoft or that OpenAI has to offer, I think that we're still going to be sadly at the whim and fancy of what they want to do as opposed to what we want to do.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I hear you. I hear the mission and I hear the I hear the risk.
It's not going to be a fast battle. I'll say
Yeah.
that. Like,
Yeah.
it's going to be a long, I've been a Linux user for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. And, Linux just recently hit a big milestone, which is that we estimate that we're about 2% adoption, woo, that's crazy. But like,
Yeah.
that is still huge growth. Like
Yeah.
it used to be 0.1 or 0.3 kind of thing. So
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
the same kind of vibe where we need the ability for the democratization of these technologies to be put in the hands of the people so that we aren't reliant on profit-driven companies to be dictating how they're going to work and how they're going to be used.
Yeah.
I know that makes me sound like a crazy anti-capitalist, but the sad reality is these technologies are too powerful. We should maybe start talking about AI more like it's, a utility that the government has to regulate, like electricity or something like that. These are going to become fundamental needs in the future of how we work.
Yeah. Okay. So part of, I guess, what I've heard to an extent answers a question or adds to an answer that I've already gotten from you. So I asked the question of, for our listeners now, what can they take away in terms of how they engage with AI? Another thing that you've talked often about is really asking the question of who sources, who does it. So in the future, if there's a bot put out there that's like, hey, talk to us, we're going to support you on your weight loss journey, the question really has to be who hosts that? Is it a larger company? And if so, who are the minds behind that? Is there reward in that you pay a one-time fee, or is it a subscription model? Therefore, you need to be in there forever, like a Weight Watchers, right? Which was demonstrated to not help people, demonstrated to keep you looped in. The question is, what's the model behind it?
Yeah.
Is it run by academics and doctors? Is it run by an organization that wants you sucked in for a monthly subscription fee?
Exactly. There's 4 questions that you should be asking whenever, not just, a new large language model or a new piece of AI, but any new technology. 4 questions you should ask: who owns and operates it?
Mm-hmm.
What objectives does that technology have? What capabilities does it have access to? And what data can it access or use?
Yeah.
If you understand that, you can be yourself way more informed as to how you use it. This is ultimately comes down to the word transparency. We need transparency in how a lot of this technology operates. And, like you said, if it says, hey, we're a non-for-profit of doctors that made this thing to improve mental health, yeah, okay, I feel pretty good about using that thing. Whereas, if OpenAI says, hey, we're trying to convert to be a full for-profit company so that we can launch on the NASDAQ, okay, you might have some ulterior motives that are misaligned for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, sir. I appreciate this, and I hope the audience as well appreciates this, because I think you've offered a little bit more transparency and clarity into something that we all want to be the solution within healthcare, and could be a solution within healthcare, but currently is still in that toddler phase.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it could be an amazing solution. Like the potential for individualization and personalization is so huge. But again, we need to make sure that the background objectives are in the right hands for that to be done right.
Yeah. 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 I don't think I'd ever thought about the idea of decentralized bot to the end where I would have my own personalized one that is exclusively learning me and has my best interests and is
Yeah.
closed off to the world. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've been playing around. Again, the problem is we're still behind on the technology, so we're not there yet. But I've been playing around with my own local LLMs and
Mhm.
local like visual generative models, and just to experiment and keep myself familiar with it. The
Yeah.
issue is a lot like Linux 20 years ago. It's something that only the super nerd who wants to roll up their sleeves and waste the kind of time is willing to do. So
Yeah. Yeah. But until then, we get to have conversations with the super nerds of the world that help us pedestrians figure out how we're going to navigate the space. So,
exactly.
sir, on behalf of the pedestrians, thank you so very much. This was a delightful conversation, and we're very grateful to the offering in particular. Napita is very grateful for it. In particular, given that you're not feeling the best. So, thank you so very much.
Of course, it was fun. Apologies if I hacked up a lung all over the mic.
Audience, we hope that this was of use to you. We will make sure in the podcast notes that we link to Dr. Saunderson, his lab, and ongoing. I know that he's a very prolific writer in this space, so we'll link to some of his more public-facing papers that can help you navigate this wonderful space, and to his RAP lab as well, where I would imagine one day maybe Kendrick could be a resident.
Yeah, man. Anybody who can spit a sick bar, they'll instantly get into my PhD program.
Yeah. There we go. All right. So, audience, Dr. Saunderson, thank you so very much. Until next time, I wish you all adieu. À bientôt, mes amis. À bientôt. Au revoir.